In this lesson, we're going to be looking at how we can generate a random number using Math.random in JavaScript, and then also how we can use the math floor or the math ceiling in order to round up or down, and then generating a function that's going to create a random number, including the minimum and the maximum that we're passing into the function. And now we're generating that 50 times, and we see the smallest number that we get is a 1, and the highest number that we get is a 5. As we're passing in the minimum of 1 and the maximum of 5 into this function. So we can also update this if we want. So we can go to a maximum of 10 and continue to generate random numbers using the minimum and the maximum. I've set up an HTML file that's got 3 page elements: an input, a button, and a div. So the div we can use to output results, the button we can use to create an action for the user, and the input is where we can get an input value from the user. Connected to a JS file called code.js, and this is completely blank. So first of all, we want to select some of the page elements. We're going to be selecting the input, the button, and the element, the div with the class of results. And we only just have the one input. So I'm going to create some variables within JavaScript to make it easier to access the page elements using the document query selector, selecting the input field. We're also going to get the button, so I'm just going to indicate that with btn. And once again, using the document, select the button element. So that will select all 3 page elements. We're going to add an event listener to the button. And the event that we're going to be listening for is going to be a click event. And it's going to run the function myAction whenever the button gets clicked. Create the function. You can pass in the event object as well. And for now, within the console, output the value of ready. So let's make sure that the button is clickable. We get the output into the console of ready. So we're ready to move on to the next part where we're going to introduce the random. I'm going to update this. Instead of it'll be a text type, set it to type of number for the input. So this will be a number value. And then also I'm going to set a default value for the my input. And this could just be done using JavaScript. So start out with a default value of 5. Let's use the Math.random method in order to return back this number of results, and we're going to just output that into the output area of the page. Then we'll use the current my input value for the number of times we want to loop and iterate through to produce the results. For the output, we're going to append a brand new element. So we'll create a div using the document, create element, and the element that we're creating will be a div. And within that div element, add in the text content. And this will be the result of the Math.random method. And then for the output, append the div to the output element. So that way we get it on the page. So that returns back 5 iterations or whatever number we've got set here. And that will just add that into the results area every time we click the button. So that's what we get for Math.random. So this is returning back a floating point pseudo number. So it ranges from 0 to less than 1. So they're always going to be decimal, 0 decimal, and then the series of digits that are afterwards. And these are randomly generated numbers. So in order to update this to have a random number from 0 to 5, we can set the random number as the maximum random that we want. So let's set the max value. And if we want the maximum value of 5, we'll add that in as max. And we'll multiply this by the value of max. So let's see what we get returned back. So now we get numbers of 0 all the way to 4. But we're not going to ever hit 5. So we can click it as many times as we want, and we're not getting up to 5. And we've also still got all of the decimal places. So that's where JavaScript Math has another method that you can either round down or round up. So we're going to round down the numbers. So whatever number that we have, and I'll just create a variable that's going to return back the random number so that we can see what the math floor is going to be doing. So we've got a value of math floor for the random. And I'm going to use the backticks. So these are backticks for the template literals. So that's going to be floor. And we can also do a math of ceiling, and that will round it up. So math ceiling, and then we'll just output the actual original value just before we do the floor and the ceiling. So that will output that text content. So when we do this, we see that the math floor produces a result of 4, and the math ceiling produces a result of 5 on this number. So it rounds it up or down. So this is how we can use the math and the math floor or the math ceiling to get an actual random number. So if we wanted to take this number and have a value from 0 to 4, then we can use the result from math floor. If we want to have a value of 1 to 5, then we can use the value of math ceiling in order to generate our random number. So let's create another function, and this one is just going to be the random number. So it'll generate a random integer, and we'll pass in these values for the max. So we'll pass in a minimum value and a maximum value that we want to return back. And then we can use these within the math random to return back a random math value within that range. So within here, we're going to be returning back a value of math random, and we're going to be using the math floor in order to round it down to the nearest full integer number. So the math random and the math floor, and we need to then multiply it by what we want for the max value. So that will be the max value there, and then we'll incorporate the minimum value afterwards. So let's make a quick update to this. I'll comment out the previous output, and instead we're going to be generating a random value. So we just use the make random integer function that we created, and the max, we already have a max value, and let's also set a minimum value, and then we'll pass those into the function and return back the result. And I'll move this out of both of those commented out areas. So now we get a random value from 0 to a maximum of 4. So we're not hitting the 5 because we haven't incorporated the minimum value. And in order to get the minimum, we have to do some calculation here where we'll take the maximum value and subtract the minimum value that we're multiplying it by. And so now what's going to happen now is we're going to produce a result from 0 to 3 because we've subtracted the minimum, but we need to add the minimum back in. So this will get a random number between the two values where the maximum is not included, but the minimum is included. So if we do it 50 times, we get a number of 1 to 4. So if we want to include the maximum, so it depends on whether you want to include the maximum or if we want it up to max, so this would be the maximum number. So if we want to include the maximum, then we could take the value of maximum minus minimum plus 1. So that would allow us to include the maximum value in the random return value. So now we get a value from a minimum of 1 to a maximum of 5. So there's got 5, there we have 1, and those are the values that we're getting returned back when we're doing the calculation. So this is how you can create a random number generator where you can pass in a minimum number and a maximum number and get a returned result back. And remember, these are including these numbers. So if you don't want to include, then you just remove out the +1, and that's going to generate a random number between and not including the maximum value.